This isn't malware for profit. No data was stolen, no ransom was demanded. This is destructive code, written to wipe tens of thousands of devices off the map. The author called himself Janitor, a digital vigilante, or a terrorist depending on who you ask. This is a true story of BrickerBot, and the person behind it.
So most hackers break into systems. This one destroyed them, not for money, not for power, but because he thought it was the only way to save the internet. His name was Janitor, and in 2017, he quietly launched one of the most aggressive cyber operations ever deployed, a botnet called BrickerBot. Except it wasn't like anything we have seen before. It didn't take over devices, it killed them permanently. To tell this story right, I partnered with someone who didn't just study BrickerBot. He was one of the few people Janitor actually reached out. Pascal analyzed the attacks, received the original payloads, and even spoke to Janitor through encrypted messages. He helped the world understand what BrickerBot really was and what it meant. Together, we are going to unpack the full story from the rise of Mirai to Janitor's underground manifesto to the moment everything went dark. It started like most modern cyber disasters do, with bad code and worse decisions. In 2016, a botnet called Mirai brought down a massive part of the internet using nothing but IP cameras and routers. That moment changed everything. It proved the Internet of Things wasn't just vulnerable, it was weaponized. And it was in that chaos that Janitor started watching.
We will have to go back in history until 2016. I don't know if you remember DDoS attacks targeting OVH and Krebs, and also Dyn DNS, which impacted a large number of providers in the US because their DNS system was down. And that was by a botnet called Mirai. And that Mirai found resources in IoT devices. So everything that's connected to the internet, mostly in consumer connected homes, like routers, cameras, DVR, which don't have a lot of security or where security was an afterthought. And Mirai was able to compromise millions of those devices by just using a list of 60 passwords. Mirai leveraged or used them to perform DDoS attacks. Faraz Jah, the author behind the Mirai botnet, published his botnet on GitHub so that everybody has access to it. So from that point on, we saw a lot of Mirai botnets going around, a lot of new variants coming out, and a lot of attacks. So that was the start where everybody started researching IoT botnets and the vulnerabilities in IoT devices, because those were a really big risk for the availability of the internet and the internet going forward.
So Mirai wasn't just a wake-up call. It was a proof of failure at scale. And someone out there had decided that if no one else was going to fix it, he would. He didn't go public. He didn't deface websites. He logged into routers using default credentials, renamed them default password, and left no ransom, no malware, just a message. This is your fault.
And that's where also the Janitor comes on the scene. Because the Janitor also saw all this happening. And he was already active. He was already studying service provider networks, and he was already looking at configurations from service providers. And when you read his blogs that he wrote when he stopped his project and then he reached out to the public and wanted his message to be known, you see that he was mostly concerned about how security was set up, how devices were left with default ports open, like management interfaces open to the internet. So a lot of things that would allow black hats to get access to a large service provider network and get access to private information from consumers, but maybe also from companies, because some of those devices were also used by small and medium and even large companies. So that's where the janitor started looking for all kinds of misconfigurations in service provider networks. And that's where he finds several devices that had default passwords. If you're old enough, like we are, Yaniv, then you might remember seeing at some point routers in a network that were labeled with a hostname default password. And you could even, back in the time, you could go to Showdown.io or Grey Noise or ZoomEye, which are IoT search engines. An IoT search engine is something that scans the internet continuously, and it tries to connect to a device. So whenever it finds an IP address that responds, it tries to connect to the HTTP port, to HTTPS, to SSH, to Telnet, not to break in, just the connection to get a banner back. So typically when you make an initial connection, you get a banner. With that banner, you can already get a lot of information. If you do an HTTP request, you get a server response back. You will see in the header variables of the HTTP response what kind of server it is. Is it an Apache? What version? Is it? Sometimes you get information from the certificate. Certificate might reveal the host name of the website that is running on that website. When you do a telnet, you get a banner, and most of the devices, like IoT devices who have the telnet port open by default on all interfaces, they might tell you if they are like a Hikvision IP camera or a Ubiquity router or another Markov router like a VNet. So it's a lot of information that you can collect. And those IoT search engines, they scan the internet and they collect that information, put it in a big database. At the same time, you also have all the vulnerabilities that are known for Apache or for IoT devices which have a CVE record. For example, you can say, okay, give me all the IP addresses that are vulnerable for this specific vulnerability, and he will give you a list of IP addresses. So, and in there, you also see the host name of the device, and the janitor left already traces there in the host name of many of routers by putting in default password, because he didn't like that some providers and some users were leaving their modem in the default configuration with the default admin password. This already changed now, so newer devices that you buy from manufacturers, mostly in China, when you install them out of the box, now you need to give yourself a password. They got smarter, they don't use a default password anymore. But back in the day, passwords were like, okay, admin or admin password 123. You just had to look in the documentation to find what is the fixed password here. And even if it was a complex password, it's only a matter of looking for the documentation, identifying the name of the vendor of the device and getting access to the device. And default passwords were all over the place, because be realistic, how many people didn't install a modem and never changed the password? In most cases, those modems are running in homes from people who are not IT experts. So they install a modem, they have the Wi-Fi up, and when the Wi-Fi is working, we don't touch it anymore because the Wi-Fi is working now. If I touch it, it might break. So they don't do firmware upgrades, they don't do password changes, they don't do configuration changes. And at the same time, there might be someone in that device that is using it for DDoS attacks or for other malicious purposes. Because it can also be used as a gateway, as a router or forwarder, anonymous routing, like anonymous networks that you can access through VPN services. Those devices can give access to bad guys to perform attacks on different levels, be it intrusions or penetration testing or scanning and DDoS attacks, which is what we saw mostly from Mirai. So as the janitor was looking at those devices and was doing his research, he found a lot of security issues, and he saw that those IoT problems were starting to get bigger. He started to notice botnets that were enslaving like millions of those IoT devices, and that can be used for attacks. And he was concerned about this. He didn't want the internet to break because of a large botnet performing DDoS attacks. So what he did is he used all the routers that he had access to, and he started using them as sensors to listen for noise from IoT botnets. when we were talking about the janitor, he got in touch with us and he signed all his emails with the janitor. But if you look also at his post that he posted on Pastebin, so it's like a public source where you can anonymously post information. He put blogs up there explaining what he was doing, why he was doing it, and all his research, what he found that was not good about several devices and ISPs that he analyzed. He also signed with Dr. Cyborkian, and also he called his project Internet Chemotherapy. He said that the internet was a patient that was terminally ill and something needed to be done. And to do that, we needed to actually destroy parts of the internet to be able to revive the patient. That was actually his project and what he was talking about.
So he blamed the vendors, the ISPs, the engineers who shipped insecure tech by default. Janitor wasn't looking to exploit vulnerabilities. He was making a list, a long one. And when it was complete, he started building something. Janitor didn't want more devices. He already had thousands, routers and modems he had quietly taken over. But he didn't use them to launch attacks. He turned them into sensors, passive, silent, waiting.
Now, the janitor is a little bit different. The BrickerBot, the botnet that we discovered from the janitor, is not really scanning and infecting. What BrickerBot does is exactly like a honeypot. It's listening. So it's listening for signals like somebody coming in through Telnet or somebody coming in through HTTP and trying to infect the router where BrickerBot is running on. Whenever BrickerBot sees that happening, he records the source IP and then he attacks that device because he knows that device is infected by a malware. There is no reason that this malware should be connecting here to me. So he connects back, tries to identify the kind of device, tries to get in, and when he can get in, then he will run several kinds of tests and several kinds of payloads. So the first thing that BrickerBot tries to do is try to secure the device. He will try to kill any process that is malicious, take it out, and then close the open ports. That is one way of protecting devices. If that doesn't work, he might do other things like delete the default route. And then when you delete the default route, the device loses internet connection. The owner of the device will have to troubleshoot, or will have to call his ISP, which maybe do a firmware upgrade, which might fix the problems in the device because it's now updated firmware. Or maybe they saw something else like, oh, look, this was infected. We need to be more careful. We need to close that port because hackers can get access. So he tries to get the attention of the owners of the device by disconnecting them from the internet so they can fix potential problems if they see it. If that doesn't work, it might be that he comes back later when they get reinfected and then just breaks the device. So his last resort, and he always called that plan B, is to run code on a device to destroy it. Now, the way that I first came across the botnet itself, across BrickerBot, was by accident. So I was running IoT honeypots back at the time, trying to catch malware in my honeypot and then analyze the malware. So I had one of those malwares, a Mirai variant, that I was running in a separate part of my network, which I let do the scanning. So I let it openly scan to see and analyze what it was doing. I knew that it was not gonna infect the device because Mirai infects through a central server. So I let it do the scanning, but I cut the connection with the command and control server. So whenever it found a victim, it would not report that to the server so that the victim would not be infected. So I was analyzing the scanning, but all of a sudden I saw in my honeypots a lot of connections coming in from a new kind of malware, new kind of bot that was not trying to infect my honeypot, but to break it. So I saw lots of code where it says cat/dev/urandom, which is a command to generate random data and send that to a file system, to a compact flash, directly to the disk device, which I never saw. And it was running on my screen like crazy. So I saw this running all the time and I was looking at it and said, what is happening here? So, and I didn't understand, of course, that I was testing in my lab, and while testing, that device or the bot that I was testing by accident triggered one of the BrickerBots, and he came at me. So that's why actually nobody ever saw BrickerBot in their honeypots, because BrickerBot doesn't do scanning. It's very silent. It's very covert. It only attacks when it knows that it's a device infected with another malware. So after a while, I figured out that was how it worked. So the way that I then was able to map out where BrickerBot is at that time and how many devices there were was by scanning the internet and by connecting on Telnet and different ports, or probing different ports until the device comes back at me. So I just went out and probed several ports on all the IP, across the IP range, without doing anything else, just probing them, just making a connection. That was enough. Just making a connection and then breaking the connection, and then just waiting. And then the BrickerBots would come at me and try to infect me. So that was how I was able to map out where the different BrickerBots were. But those were only the publicly accessible ones, because there were also BrickerBots inside service provider networks who were not always accessible from the outside. So he reused them to run his BrickerBot code. The BrickerBot code was written in Python, and as he did his research, he added more and more vulnerabilities and ways to get into a device. The janitor, he never called himself a hacker. He always says, yeah, I'm only 3 years into this with experience, but whenever he comes back from his work for the rest of the evening, is doing the same thing for 3 years, that's what I call an expert. So he had lots of vulnerabilities that he encoded in his BrickerBot and that he used to try to infect devices. And that code actually, when he stopped, because after 2 years, he found that it became too hot for him. We had too many clues who he was, so he became scared about his security. So he said, now it's time to stop. And then he sent out his modules that he used in Python, because most of them were obfuscated. So even though he was running that BrickerBot on routers that he broke in, he obfuscated the code so that whoever was able to find that could not find out what he had written. But he sent out some deobfuscated code of most of the vulnerabilities. There were thousands of vulnerabilities in that code. Some of them were 0 days, so unknown. Well, not 0 days, and that could break the internet, I would say, but small variations on existing. There was also a whole lot of SSH vulnerabilities. These he never disclosed because he was scared if somebody could use that, they could use it to move from one node to another inside a network. So he didn't want to disclose that. But most of that information was provided to most of us as a researcher. So I got an email from him with all that information and where his blog posts were. But then later he also put out an IP address to a router where he published that code in one of his blogs. So whoever wanted, and there's several researchers who looked at his code and who tried to understand what was happening back at the time.
Plan A, detect infections, block them, fix what could be fixed. But if that failed, Plan B was simple and permanent. Brick the device, wipe its memory, take it offline, forever. Most people never saw it, but in the background of the internet, a war was playing out between competing botnets. Some enslaved devices. One tried to destroy them.
He also talks about the battlefield, and it's true there's actually a war going on out there for your devices. So I said when Mirai code came out, it was published, all of a sudden you have dozens of people who want to create their own botnet and sell it to the highest bidder or sell it as a service to create DDoS attacks. So all those different bot herders, there were in the same market, and they were all fighting for the same pool of resources. It's a huge pool, yeah. Okay, because worldwide IoT devices, there's so many of them. But still, they were fighting for the same devices. So that means that if you just use the stock Mirai with the known default passwords in Telnet, well, you will get only so far. So that's where new research came in, where many of the bot herders trying to find new vulnerabilities in IoT devices. And that's where one specific protocol has an importance, which is TR069. TR069 is a management protocol used by service providers to manage large amounts of devices through a management server. And a lot of devices had the TR069 port open to the 1 by default. So that means that if you know the IP address, you could access that TR069 port and manage that device. Managing was mostly limited. You could not do everything, but there were some vulnerabilities that were discovered. So at some point, we saw vulnerabilities in TR069 being abused. TR069 is an HTTP protocol and it uses SOAP. So SOAP is like XML. It's an XML command that you send to a device and then it decodes that SOAP envelope, gets the command out, executes the command. So in that XML, at some point you could put the NTP server, and in the NTP server there was a remote command execution vulnerability. So that meant that whoever implemented the TR069 service took that NTP server command, did not sanitize it, put whatever comes through in the envelope, in the command, and put that in the NTP server configuration. And whenever the NTP server runs, NTP is a network time protocol, by the way. Whenever the NTP server runs, it would then execute the malicious code that was in that configuration statement. So there was no sanitation done. It was a vulnerability. And we saw that abused in many occasions because, whoever has TR069 open means a lot of modems that are being managed, because it's a protocol that you're using for managing very large amounts of modems. TR069 abused against many service providers. One of them was Deutsche Telekom back at the time. And Deutsche Telekom came out of it, or found it out, because at some point there were users starting to complain that they couldn't connect to the internet anymore. And then they found out that for 900,000 modems, the default route was gone. So imagine that. So that's close to 1 million routers that could have been taken over by a botnet and used in an attack. So, and that was through the TR069 protocol. That's one of the vulnerabilities that the janitor put in his BrickerBot. Now, he claims that he was the one that sent that signal or sent those payloads to the Deutsche Telekom modems, because at the same time there was also another actor that was active. There's other projects. Look at Hajime. Hajime was a botnet that came out like a couple of months after Mirai. And Hajime is a special botnet in that sense that most of the botnets that we saw until then were connecting to a central command and control server. So whenever the bot infected the device, it makes a connection to a central infrastructure where the attacker can send commands to that infrastructure and communicate with all his bots that are connected to that same server. Hajime was a distributed peer-to-peer botnet, which means it didn't use a central server. It used a BitTorrent network. You know BitTorrent, which is a distributed network for sharing files. It uses DH tables, so hash tables. That way it can find other resources across the globe. Now, in Hajime, it was communicating through files on the torrent network, on BitTorrent. So, and those files were encrypted with a private key, and only the one who has the private key, so only the one with the keys to the botnet, was able to send commands to his botnet. Also, these devices were built to automatically scan, like Mirai. They scan by themselves, and whenever they found the victim, they published that into BitTorrent, and then another device, not the same device, but another device, would take that victim and start to infect it. So it was like a self-sustaining botnet. So there's no central server that you can take out. They're replicating and they're moving, and it took a long time before this whole botnet was gone from the internet, because it's like a living organism. There was no way to take it down. So, and Hajime never carried any attack payload. Hajime just came in, kicked out and cleaned up whatever bots were already on the device, closed all the ports, allocated all the ports that no new bots could come in and infect that device. And it just stayed there.
It was a digital arms race. Mirai, Reaper, Hajime, BrickerBot. And while everyone else fought for control, Janitor fought for absence. He didn't want to rule the botnet world. He wanted to burn it down. And then the casualties started to show. Small ISPs, national providers, devices dying by the thousands, and no one could explain why.
There was a service provider in the US called SierraTel. It's in California. It's not such a big one. And actually they were, according to the Janet, they were one of the better ones because they actually admitted that their devices were infected by malware, and that was the root cause of all the problems. And they got really bad press about this, which is unfortunate because for once somebody comes out and talks about the real problem. There's many instances where the real problem never comes up because companies don't want their reputation to be dragged through the media. So SierraTel at some point got customers calling them and telling them, hey, my internet is down. And after technical analysis, they found out that it was the modem that was the problem. The modem was not starting anymore. So they asked people, come in and we will give you a new one. And when they connected the new one, problem was solved. BrickerBot was doing his work. He was bricking more devices. More customers came in to service their modem, and they ran out of new, fresh modems. So at some point, they had to send people back home without a modem and left them home for 2 or 3 days without internet before they had the time to reflash all the devices. Because all those devices were broken, so they had to reflash all of them. That takes time, that reflashing process. So the people were home so it's several days without internet. And once they get the reflash device back, of course, it does work again. There was also another actor that was active, which was Spider-Man. This was his alias. Spider-Man was actually hired by the CEO of Cellcom in Liberia because we all know the court proceedings. So the court proceedings came out. The real name of Spider-Man was Daniel K. So Daniel K was hired by a Cellcom CEO as a hacker for hire to help Cellcom in Liberia become the #1 service provider. So they wanted to go against their #1 competitor in Liberia, and he asked Daniel K, hey, find me some dirt on that other service provider that I can use to put them in bad press and to get more users to my service. So they started, so Daniel K started investigating and hacking, did not find anything interesting. So everything that I say comes from the court proceedings, that what Daniel K himself told afterwards. But as this was developing, so he didn't find anything. So, and then he thought, hey, what about if I start doing denial of service attacks against him? That would cause network disruptions, users will be unhappy, they will automatically come to your service. So the CEO of Cellcom said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So he went out and started renting different booter and stressor services. Booter and stressor is DDoS as a service. So those are the guys that I already talked about, the bot herders that create a botnet and then sell it to whoever wants a subscription, subscribes for $25 per month, and then can have access to that botnet to perform DDoS attacks to any host they want to use. So DDoS as a service was big at that time and still big now, by the way. But Daniel K tried to access some DDoS as service, but they weren't strong enough. And there's evidence of that because some of those DDoS service provider or DDoS services were taken down and the logs were analyzed. And in some chats, you saw an actor by the name of Spider-Man asking, hey, don't you have more capacity? Because I need a bigger botnet. So he could not find a botnet that was big enough to attack his target. So, and then Mirai happened. Spider-Man saw that happening. So Daniel K saw that happening and said, that's interesting. How about I run my own botnet? So, and then he started researching, and then he came out on that vulnerability of TR069. So, and then he started infecting all different service providers across the globe. In the UK, in Germany, there were different ones, and started building a very large botnet. At some point, his botnet, he believed, was large enough to perform his big attack, so he went after the biggest competitor of Cellcom in Liberia, started his attack, but the attack was so big, there were so many botnets from all over the world that were sending malicious traffic, lots of volume, towards that provider in Liberia, that he completely saturated the internet lines going into Liberia. So completely disconnecting Liberia from the internet. And that was the moment where the authorities saw that happening and started to go after or trying to find out who was behind it. And eventually Daniel K was apprehended as he was boarding a flight in London to fly back to Cyprus, where he had an apartment at the time, with $10,000 in his pocket. He just came from an evening dinner with the CEO that he was working for, got his monthly pay, which was about $10,000 per month, I believe it was. So, and that's where they apprehended him, and then the whole story came out. You can search for this, Daniel K. Search it on the internet, aka Spider-Man.
So Sierra Telecom was overwhelmed. Daniel's K attack on Liberia showed what could happen when botnets went unchallenged. For Janitor, these weren't accidents. They were proof of what needed to be stopped. To fight a botnet, you have to see it, and Janitor had eyes everywhere.
Now, getting access to an infected bot is not, or an infected device is not as easy as you would think, because botnets, of course, as I said, there was lots of competition, so everybody was searching for new vulnerabilities, and there were plenty at the time. Whenever a researcher looked at an IoT device, they came up with a list of vulnerabilities, published that, and of course you can imagine those were used by the bad guys to actually get access to IoT devices, because you have to know, if somebody finds a vulnerability in a D-Link router that is 5 years old, that is not in support anymore, that sits in homes from people, even if D-Link creates a patch and publishes a firmware, how many of the 100,000 devices that were installed will get that software update, do you think? Do you really think that mom and pops at home are looking or subscribe to the right blogs and are reading security outlets like Bleeping Computer or others, where they say, hey, new vulnerability discovered, you have to install this patch or CVE this and this and this, and you have to install a firmware update? No, of course not. They're not looking at that. So all those devices, even though that there's a firmware update available, they don't get updated. So those devices, and still now, there's still devices out there that have been connected for 10 years to the internet who are running outdated firmware, who are victims of infections. Now, the thing about IoT botnet is most of the botnets were not persistent, or most of the bots were not persistent. So they were able to infect the device, but they were running in memory. They did not have enough access to the configuration. So they were not able to find admin access to get to the configuration to make themselves persistent. So they just run on the device. Whenever there's a power outage somewhere, you would see that a whole lot of modems were cleaned. And so power outages were very effective for cleaning the problem out of a network, because the device reboots and the bot is gone. However, on average, 2 minutes later, a new bot was already knocking at that door and taking over the device. So I run honeypots at my house because somebody claimed that every 2 minutes there's a bot knocking on your device at home. So I said, okay, I want to see that. So I created my honeypot and I just run it on my internet line for my provider. And effectively, less than 2 minutes on average, there's a botnet trying to break into my device to try to infect it. And that's how I started in the whole IoT honeypot thing, actually. So now, whenever such a bot comes in and takes over the device, I said there's lots of competition. So there was a lot of time spent on finding new vulnerabilities and adding new vulnerabilities to their botnets to make them more performant, to find more devices, but also to outcompete other botnet herders. So what you would see is a lot of new variants from Mirai coming out at the time. And still today, we see still a lot of variants of Mirai. It was a very, very good code base. It did not have lots of vulnerabilities. It only uses a list of default passwords. That was all that Mirai did. And I was able to enslave back at the time because it was the first hundreds of thousands, close to 1 million devices. And claims are, the janitor said that he bricked easily over 200 million devices across his 2 years that he was active, which is still, I think, a conservative number, because if you look at the number of IoT devices that are out there, the number of problems that have been described across those 2 years in that period, it was amazing. Every week there was a new vulnerability coming out by a researcher. And as I said, those vulnerabilities, as they were published, typically when a vulnerability is disclosed, the researcher would already have worked with the company who has the vulnerability, and they would make a patch available. That's what CISOs do nowadays. They track all their software products and they make sure that they are up to date with their software patches. The same goes for IoT devices. However, there's no CISO sitting there to update the IoT device. If the service provider doesn't do it centrally, and sometimes it's even, at home, people just buy a Wi-Fi router in the supermarket. They put it behind their modem. Done. They have a firewall. My PlayStation can connect. My tablet can connect. I'm happy. Don't touch it because I don't want it to break. So leave it as it is. Firmware update. No. Even for us, Yaniv, I don't know if you remember, but a couple of years ago, whenever you did a firmware update, it was like fingers crossed that the device comes back up. Because you put some flash in it or you connect with a website and you upload the firmware update and then it starts rolling. And then you see disconnected because it's rebooting. And then it's like, oh, is it coming back up? Oh, this takes long. After 2-3 minutes, is it still alive? So even for us, it's a stressful moment to update firmware because it can break. We've known devices to break, a lot of devices to break whenever you did a firmware upgrade. That's when things go wrong. Or they come back up with default configuration. You lost all your configuration. So some of these people work like a week to make their Wi-Fi work and to make the internet work. So they don't want to go through that whole pain again. So they don't bother updating their firmware every couple of months. So those devices never get fixed, actually. So whenever there was a researcher coming out with, hey, there's a new vulnerability and it's affecting 100,000 devices, bot holders were like, oh, thank you. Give it to me. I'm going to go and try to get those devices. And then all the competition happened because all of them are going after the same devices. So then you saw a lot of activity, and that's where actually bots, whenever they infect a device, the first thing that they do is run a bot killer function. So the function, I call it a bot killer function because the function is called bot killer. Actually, when you look at the code, it's called bot killer. And what bot killer does is just go search for different signs that there is malware on the device. Mirai is pretty nifty at that. What they do in Mirai, so first you can go to the process table. So most of those IoT devices, they run a Linux operating system. Just like you would install a Linux on any device that you have. So Linux is very efficient, lightweight, and it's open source, so it's free. So they run Linux. They don't run a full shell. They run a shell called BusyBox. BusyBox comes back a lot in those IoT devices. So BusyBox is like a replacement of the shell commands. You have the command ls to list files, ps to list processes. All those commands in the full Linux are implemented as separate executable binaries. BusyBox takes the most important commands like ls, ps, and implements it directly in one big executable. So it's like this one executable is the shell with all the commands in one, which makes it very easy for whoever builds a new Linux device with a limited operating system. They just put BusyBox on it and they have all the functionality from the shell that they need. They don't need to separately install all the commands, and it's very easy to build, and it's built for IoT devices. So that's why you see it coming back on IoT devices a lot. So whenever they had a device, so Mirai can do a process list and try to identify a process that has a certain name, because most of the botnets would have a certain name. And then he would go and kill those processes. A more nicer trick was actually also to go and search for the port 22. So whoever has allocated port 22 and port 23. Whenever a botnet infects a device, it doesn't want new botnets to come in. So what does a bot do? It kills the telnet daemon who is listening for new connections on telnet and then allocates the port. And by allocating the port, when the telnet daemon starts again, because telnet daemon, when you kill it, it restarts. So there's a watchdog that makes sure that telnet daemon restarts. Now, when telnet daemon restarts and tries to open port 23, no, it's already taken by somebody else. So he stops. He backs off. Yeah. But that means that The bot is in control of port 23. So when you connect to the device, you cannot connect through telnet because the bot has it in control. So what the Mirai bot also does is looking for whoever has allocated port 23. Whoever has a socket listening on port 23, that process, I kill it. Because 90% chance this is probably a bot. Another way was to find a process that was running in memory, but without a file. So in Unix, whenever you start an executable, when it's running in memory, you can delete the file. When you delete the file, it keeps running. That's because the file system in Unix, it only deallocates blocks whenever there's no reference anymore to them. So when you delete the file, you're just deleting an entry in the list in the directory table, but the blocks are still allocated for that file. So, and typically when a bot is installed, the bot runs itself, and the first thing it does is delete the file so there's no evidence left, right? They don't want you to see, oh, malware, the name of the file is malware. They don't want you to go to the device and list the table and see, oh, malware, so I'm infected. No, it's running and it deletes itself. So Mirai would also go search for those kind of clues, which is very interesting how they find those competing bots and kill them. Doing that, you also see that there's lots of security measures that they set up. Whenever they infect a device, they try to defend the router from the vulnerability they used to get in. So they fix the vulnerability of the router. Why? To prevent another botnet from coming in. So they're actually keeping a stronghold on that device so that it can stay theirs forever.
He didn't rely on honeypots. He had firmware-level access to real routers. His intelligence wasn't simulated, it was live. Then one day he stopped. No more payloads, no more messages.
There's a couple of theories that I have why he might have disappeared. So for one, yeah, we were in touch with him and we knew how his BrickerBot worked back at the time because I found out and then we documented it. We didn't know the depth and the breadth of his whole research. For him, it was actually time to tell his story because he was trying to help or trying to fix the internet from the shadows. So he was sitting in the shadows and he was just breaking devices and people were angry, didn't understand why they were angry at him. And he didn't want them to continue to be angry at him because breaking devices. He wanted to expose this whole thing and didn't want them to continue to be angry at him because breaking devices. He wanted to expose this whole thing and say, hey, look, you have to look at the service providers that are not doing their work. You have to look at the IoT vendors that are not doing their work, the government. So he was trying to inform a lot of people, but working in the shadows, of course, he didn't get his message out. I discovered a BrickerBot that was bricking IoT devices. I could not know that the guy who sits behind it, his motivation is, I want to cure the internet. For me, oh, that's a bad guy who's breaking things. Maybe he gets paid by somebody. Maybe he's a teenager that does it out of fun. Too much time, and that's so typical for hacking. A lot of teenagers roll into hacking. Why do we see a lot of teenagers? Well, it's like playing games. Playing games is like breaking a puzzle for them. Hacking is like breaking a puzzle. When they play games, they are in a certain community. They're on Discord. They talk to friends. They brag about things they do. Then all of a sudden they get access to special code that gives them an edge in their game, cheaters. And then they start to roll into that area that's closer coming to hacking. And then they see, oh, hacking is like breaking a puzzle. It's fun. And they have time. So that's how a lot of teenagers are involved in those attacks. Now, he's clearly not a teenager. He has much more experience than that. And he's much more mature than that. But yeah, for me, it looked like, yeah, that's just a criminal trying to break devices. Little did I know the whole story that goes behind it, and that his project was already 3 years going on, doing research and finding vulnerabilities and getting access to networks that he never should have access, even to networks where there's lots of military connected. There was a special service provider in a country that I will not name, but that marketed himself as the provider for the military. He had full access to that network for many years, and he tries to show them and give them clues about, hey, I'm here, but nobody was noticing. Those devices were vulnerable for 2-3 years without anybody noticing or doing anything about it. And of course, working from the shadows, nobody is aware of what he's doing or his message. So, and one of his motivations was to solve the problem. So from the shadows, you cannot solve that problem. So he wanted to come out with his message. So, and a good way to do that was to say, okay, I'm going to stop here. When we discovered the janitor, then I spoke with Cătălin Simpanu from Bleeping Computer at the time. He published the first report on the BrickerBot. And that's when the janitor reached out to Cătălin and then reached out to me because he saw that his BrickerBot, we gave the name BrickerBot for him. It was his project, his internet chemotherapy project. He reached out to us and then started providing a little bit more information about his motivation and so on. And then after a year, after we were monitoring him, he said, okay, I'm stopping my project. And then he published all his files and gave his code just to show how many vulnerabilities there are, how serious he is about this. So he wrote like 150 pages worth of documentation with all the details. He put it on Pastebin. Of course, I have everything that I saved, but we cannot publish everything because some of the things that are in there might be hurting some service providers and might give some information that, because there's also password hashes in there. He also did password breaking and cracking. So there's some information in there that still, after all those years, might still be hurtful. So we never published the full document on that. But he put it online for a while, so it was in Pastebin. So many researchers had access to that. So that is why I think that he went away. He didn't want to be discovered because, yeah, the more contact he had, the more he's exposed. And actually, the authorities were already asking for information about him. So I gave some files to the authorities about everything that I know about him, the emails that he sent, and so on, the code that I had. At that point, I gave it to the authorities, but I don't think that he was highest on their list of targets. I think that they had much bigger problems to work with. If you look at ransomware operators and all those attacks who are actually driven by financial motivation, and bring down actual businesses and hurt those businesses very hard, that's not at the same level as what the janitor did. So they were interested to find out who the janitor was, but it was not the highest priority on their agenda, I'm sure. So, and he also felt this happening, so he said, okay, now it's time to stop. And he didn't stop immediately. He said he would stop, and he stopped all his nodes, but he kept some nodes running. You know, there's still some out there, who knows, that are still running because they don't need human operation. They are sentinels, so they sit there, and whenever somebody attacks them, they counterattack and break the device. So it might be that they're still out there.
No name, no face, no trace, just one final message and silence. Was he a criminal, a rogue, vigilante, a prophet? That depends on how you define justice in cybersecurity. I would love to hear your voice, so leave your comment in the description.
So I would say, janitor, if you're still out there, I think that you might have to come back because we're still in a very problematic area. And what you did 10 years ago might have had a temporary impact, but we're back in the same place where we used to be. And now it's getting even worse with everything AI coming. Instead of everything needs to be connected, now everything needs to be smart and intelligent. And smart and intelligence comes with connected and with a whole lot of new problems, which will be for another video for you.
Yeah.
Yaniv, to talk about all the risk of AI agents, right?
He didn't ask for fame. He didn't sell this exploit. He just bricked the vulnerable and left. Most people called him a criminal. Some called him a vigilante. But here is the question I keep coming back to. If he hadn't acted, would Mirai have won? In a world full of threats, maybe it takes one man to become the firewall. Or maybe that's the scariest threat of all. The devices he bricked, most of them were never patched anyway. The vulnerabilities he exploited, still live, still online, still ignored. And maybe that's the point. He showed us the problem, then vanished.